All right. Okay. Welcome everybody. Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the Abridged Code of Jewish Law, Chapter 38. Chapter 38. The laws concerning bread that was baked by a non-Jew, the food that was cooked by a non-Jew, milk that was milked by a non-Jew. So there's a few issues here. Now, all the issues we're discussing here have nothing to do with kashrus. Well, I mean, they do and don't, meaning, obviously, one of the reasons we have to be careful about food made by non-Jews is that it might not be kosher, because non-Jews don't have the mitzvah to eat kosher, and there can be either something non-kosher about this dish, or it could have been cooked in utensils that had non-kosher cooked in it before, which can make the food not kosher. So there's that issue as well. So the issues we're discussing here is if everything happens to be kosher, there's still these issues. That's okay. So we've had a request that today's learning should be in the merit of the yahrzeit of Simcha ben Menachem Mendel Cohen. So that's the learning should be in his merit. Right. So presuming everything is actually the ingredients are kosher and the cooking utensils are kosher, so we still have these issues. So we started this chapter last before the festivals, and the first thing we discussed was has akum. So the bread made by non-Jews. So by bread we have three categories. We have has Yisrael. We have bread that was made by a Jew, was baked by a Jew. And again, we're leaving aside all kashrus concern. For all of these things, we're presuming everything is kosher other than these issues. Then we have, so obviously, bread made by a Jew we can have. Then we have pas palta. It's bread made by a non-Jewish baker. Now, again, we're presuming that everything is kosher, which is highly unusual today, because today most commercial bakeries, they use oils either for the bread itself or to grease the pans that are animal vegetable oil blends. And so pretty much, the breads you find in the supermarket, overall majority of them contain non-kosher ingredients. But even if it was like the old days where people just took flour and water and they kneaded in a kneading bowl that they only ever use for bread, and then they put it in the oven that they only ever use for bread because it was in a bakery, commercial bakery. So you're allowed to have pas palta, a bread made by a non-Jewish baker. So they didn't make it for themselves, it was made to sell, if there's no Jewish made bread available. Then we have pas akum. Pas akum was bread that a non-Jewish baked for themselves, and in the home, or even if they made it in the bakery, but they made it for themselves to eat. This we're not allowed to eat unless there's nothing else at all. And as we mentioned before Yom Tov, the main reason for this, because again, we're talking about in the case where it happens to be totally kosher, which in practice would be almost impossible for non-Jew made in the home, because generally speaking, they don't keep kosher. All right. But even if it happened to be, and this is primarily to avoid intermarriage, because bread, not so much in today's society, but till recent times, was the main part of the meal. And if we're going to break bread, so to speak, with all kinds of people, and people are going to end up eating and socializing together, then this can lead to this leads to intermarriage. So again, obviously, we need to be valuable members of society and to contribute to society, and to be polite and civil, and we have to be friendly with our neighbors. But there's a big difference between being friendly and constantly socializing and eating together, and this unfortunately usually only leads to the weakening of Judaism. So that was what we learned till now. So we had quite a few people join us during that recap. So we're chapter 38, Siman Lamed Ches, and we did a quick recount of the bread. Again, presuming that the bread actually was kosher, which generally speaking, bread made by non-Jews happens to contain non-kosher ingredients. But if it happened to be kosher, we still can't have the bread made by a non-Jew that made privately for themselves. If there's no Jewish bread around, Jewish bread, we don't mean the bread was Jewish, but it was made by a Jewish person, we could have kosher bread made by a non-Jewish bakery. But again, practically today, overall majority of bread made by non-Jewish bakeries contain non-kosher ingredients, either in the bread itself or in the greasing of the trays. Okay. All right. So we're up to number 4, Dalet. Chapter 38, number 4. Okay. Now, Has Shaponov Tuchim Bebeitzim. Now you've got this non-Jewish bread of the bread made by a non-Jew, and let's say it was made by the baker. So you could have it if there's no Jewish made bread. But this bread has been glazed with eggs. Often if we make bread, chalash, Shabbos bread, we glaze with eggs. It makes it a little shiny, a little nicer. So this is now an additional problem. Mishum habeitzim shalov, due to the eggs which are on it, the havlo bushli nachri. Now, even if the bread happened to contain kosher ingredients, and it's a baker, and there's no Jewish bread around, but because this now has eggs on it, it's considered the egg. We can't have many foods that are cooked by non-Jews, even if they're kosher, for the same reason as we said about the intermarriage. So having the egg on it creates a problem. So how do we have non-Jews work in kosher restaurants, different things, and hotels? At the end of this, of number 4, we'll discuss that. Now these wafers that are cooked on metal pans, there's additional concern that they may have been smeared with animal fat. In which case the grills that they have and the different things, they themselves are non-kosher because it absorbed the non-kosher food, and now this is going to be absorbed into the food that's cooking on it, and that creates an additional issue. Okay, so we've said so far, one thing in depth is about not having the bread made by non-Jews, and we've touched on, and we'll get more into it in the chapter, other foods that are cooked by non-Jews, and the idea, the issue that it creates is because we don't want an environment that leads to intermarriage. So yet we go to many kosher establishments, you go to hotels, to restaurants, different things, and there are many non-Jews who are working there. So how does that work? How does that work? So this issue still applies. So what we have to do is we have to have a Jewish person participates in the cooking in some way. So even though it might have been primarily made by a non-Jewish person, but the fact that a Jewish person did something as part of it, this turns it into it's considered like a Jew cooked it or baked it, depending on what it happens to be. So let's give some examples. So it could be, the minimum could even be turning on the fire. So when they turn on the fire, that's part of it. Obviously, you can't cook things without turning on the fire. So this is generally what they do in restaurants. They might have multiple ovens and stoves running. So the Jew turns on the fire at the beginning of the day. If it goes out, the Jew turns it there for mashkiach or turns it back on. And that's what they do. There's a bakery in Australia, totally non-Jewish owned and non-Jewish run. Obviously, they have the kosher supervisors who check it up, but it's one of these massive factories that supplies, a huge amount of supermarkets, and essentially going 24/7. And they turn off the oven every 6 months. It's the only time they turn it off. They do a cleaning and some maintenance, and then it goes back on. So what makes it considered pas Yisrael, that a Jew participated in the baking, so we don't have the intermarriage issue, or I mean, it's anyway pas palta, made for a bakery to sell. So it's you could have that if there's no Jewish bread around, as opposed to privately made non-Jewish bread. But to make it to the higher level of pas Yisrael, it's like a Jew baked it, and therefore you could have it under all circumstances, is that a Jew turns on this oven twice a year. I guess in the rare circumstance where something else happened and they had to come and turn it on another time, they'll do that also. But in other words, even the smallest act of doing something. Now, the more involvement, the better. We had the opposite, right? So normally turning on the oven is sufficient. We had the opposite recently on the Friday of Sukkot. So that Friday night we had a special function. And now we have like a little shul in our house, and we had a function, and a non-Jewish chef came to help prepare for this function. Now, normally we would turn on the ovens and let him go about his merry way, just watching to make sure the ingredients are kosher. But here it was Yontif. Yontif, we can't turn on the ovens, right? We had electric, I guess, gas you could light from an existing flame on Yontif, but we have an electric stove and electric ovens, and it was a electric rice cooker. So we couldn't turn it on. So he had to turn it on. So now we had to do something more. So we had to make sure that we actually put it into the oven. So the salmon that was cooked, one of the members of our family, it didn't have to be a member of our family. It just had to be a Jewish person that keeps Shabbos, different things, but happened to be a member of our family. That's who was there. Put it in the oven, etc. So we had to do a more active role in the cooking. So, but as long as the Jew does something of some significance, then that's considered as if it was Jewish baked or Jewish cooked. Okay. So, hey, number 5. Now, pas Yisrael she'afro nachri. Let's say he had dough. So it's Jewish bread. No, it's the dough. The Jew needed the bread. He made everything, but it was cooked, was baked by the non-Jew. So this is also problematic, right? As we said, the Jew has to have a role in the actual cooking, in actual baking. So if you take your dough and you bring to the non-Jew to cook, kara mipas nachri, lashon b'shuli nachri, it actually becomes more problematic than if a Jew. Okay, I'm just going to mute everyone because of the echo. But if you have any questions, by all means, unmute and ask your question. Okay, so it becomes more problematic. Why? Because it becomes an issue of Bishul Yisrael. This is unless the Jew prepared the oven. In this case, he gave an example of throwing in some wood. So in other words, in the old days, they had wood burning ovens. So the oven is already going, but if you add more wood to it, it's like you turned up the fire. So so what we need in this case, in modern terms, is the Jew to turn on the oven or something like that. And we have to be very careful about this when we're in a place where we're sending something. Again, in older times, there's like a communal bread oven. So when you're putting it into this oven of a non-Jewish baker, that where everyone would bake their own bread, that you have to put something in. She saw Yashlich Eitz took a tonner that a Jew should put some wood into the oven, which is same as us turning it up or doing something like that. Shnech saw it's a pass or the bread should put the bread, or the Jew should put the bread or the pan in the oven. So if you can't do the fire, then you actually have to put the food onto the fire. Okay. So that pretty much finishes the idea of the bread. Right? So to make a Jewish bread, Has Yisrael, a Jew has to participate somehow in the cooking process. Yes, David.
So there's no difference between a fire or an electrical oven.
In this aspect, it's not the difference. No, there's no halakha difference. There's just logistic difference. That a regular a fire burning oven, I can just throw in some additional fuel. The electric oven, you'd have to either turn on or off. Like I guess you could adjust it, turn it up, but you have to do something to it. Yeah.
With a fire, the fact that there's a pilot light that's lit.
So gas stoves, since every light comes off the pilot, if you have ones like that, some of them aren't like that. Some gas stoves, when you turn it on, it makes a spark, and it lights the stove. In which case, it's a new flame. So then this wouldn't work. But if you have the type of stove that everything is lit from the pilot, then the fact that you lit the pilot, then the non-Jew could turn on the other gas, hot plates or various things, and then all they did was release the gas, and they became lit from the pilot which the Jew lit. So that would be sufficient. But as I said, many stoves and ovens don't necessarily work that way. So long as they work from you turn it on, it makes a spark, and then so it's a new flame. So the Jew would have to light each oven or stove.
I'm just thinking with the pilot, like if a person who buys a new stove and they plug it in and it's going. So who lit the pilot? It could have been the workman that
Yeah, so that's not a problem generally, because in the Jewish house, let's say if it's a Jewish house, even though the pilot was lit by a non-Jew, but a Jew is having even larger part in the cooking than just putting on the fire, because he's the one putting in the oven, and he's the one who's doing the actual main part of the cooking. But if you had non-Jewish domestic help, and the pilot was lit by a non-Jew, then potentially you could have issues. A Jew would have to participate in some way. So, but it's not that the putting on the fire that necessarily that makes it Jewish cooked or not Jewish cooked. It's a Jew has to participate at some point, even if it's something only turning on the fire, even though the putting on the fire and the stirring and everything else is done by the non-Jew. But if the Jew did the other things, that's even better. Okay. So the bread again, the ideal is to have Jewish made bread, and that means as long as the Jew participated in it somehow. So many years ago, I gave hashgacha to a bakery, a sourdough bakery in Queensland, in Australia, where we lived, and there was not for pay. Sometimes there were certain things that we certified, and we earned money for the community out of it. But this bakery was, they tolerated us, and we did it so we could just have kosher bread, because it wasn't any other bakery, right? It was the only bakery. It was like a vegan sourdough place, so it was one of the few places that didn't use animal fats and different things like that. And we would go, they baked every second day, and we would go and light the fire, turn on the ovens. So so as long as we participate somehow, that makes it considered Jewish bread, Jewish made bread. If there's no Jewish made bread, then even in the first instance, if there's no Jewish made bread, you're allowed to have kosher bread that a non-Jewish baker made. So you'll see there's various breads around in the supermarkets have an OU or something, and it does not say Pas Yisrael. It's not a Jewish-made bread. So if you live in a place where there's plenty of kosher bakeries and good quality and reasonably priced different things, then it's a big question where you can have those breads. But if you live in a place where there's not, then you're allowed to eat that bread. And then, of course, there's a private person's, a private non-Jewish bread, which we can't have because we don't want to lead to intermarriage. And of course, this is all besides any kashrus problems, right? Because pretty much what non-Jews make in the home is not going to be kosher, and many bakery-made bread is not going to be kosher either. So that's Pas Yisrael. That's Jewish bread, or Pas Akum, not Jewish bread, or Pas Halta, the non-Jewish bakery bread. Now we come to the next law in this next category in this group of laws, Bishul Akum. So here we're talking about things that a non-Jew cooked, and again, we're not talking about kashrus. We're presuming, well, for this din, for this discussion, it's all kosher, because it's not kosher, then there's nothing what to talk about. Even if a Jew made it, it's not kosher. You can't eat it. Now we're speaking about things that are totally kosher, but the question is, did a Jew cook it or did a non-Jew cook it? And here there's no middle. By the bread, we have a middle. We have the Jewish-made bread, non-Jewish bread, and then we have a middle category, the bakery-made bread. This is only a leniency about bread because bread is the staple of one's diet, well, at least was until modern times. When it comes to cooked items, which are non-bread products, there's no middle ground. It's either yes, Jewish made, or no, non-Jewish made. So Bishul Yisrael, a Jew participated in the cooking, or Bishul Akum, or there was no participation. The Jew didn't cook it by a Jew, and therefore it's considered non-Jewish made. So again, we're presuming it's all kosher, right? Because the barbecue chicken at the local supermarket, usually the issue there, we don't even get to the issue that the non-Jewish make it. It's not a kosher chicken. It wasn't shechted, wasn't salted. We have bigger problems. But presuming all the ingredients were kosher. So when does it apply and when does it not apply? So we've got a few different categories. So the first thing is like this. It applies to something that can't be eaten raw. So let's use a few examples. Carrots. Carrots can be eaten raw. So let's say there were baked carrots. I'm not going to say carrots in the soup because the soup is an issue. But let's say that there's just baked carrots or fried carrots. It's all made simmus, fried carrots with honey or something like that. Then, since carrots can be eaten raw, we're not concerned about a Jew having cooked it. Okay, of course they have to be kosher. We have to make sure there's no non-kosher ingredients. Put it in the pan was kosher, but presuming it's all kosher, there's no problem. Hot dog. Hot dogs can be eaten raw. They're smoked. Even before you cook them, you could eat the hot dogs. So if it ended up being a non-Jewish cook is the one who boiled or barbecued the hot dogs, again, presuming the barbecue was kosher and everything, and they were kosher hot dogs, there's no problem. So the first thing is this Bishul Yisrael, that we need a Jew to be involved in the cooking is something that cannot be eaten raw. That's information number one. Information number two. V'gam oila al shulchan malachim lalapois boy is a pas or purpose, and it has to be something that will be served on the table of kings, even if it's just as a side dish or a dessert. Then it becomes an issue. So let's say, for example, I don't know what would be so corn. Even though today there were different varieties of corn discovered in the Americas, and we eat corn on the cob or people have corn chips. But till those corn was discovered, the varieties of corn they had in Europe and the Middle East and various places was only animal food. And therefore, when they made this decree, they quite clearly said that corn is animal food. So certainly would not be served at the table of kings. Now today we don't normally have kings per se, but you could say what would be served at a presidential reception. But I think a better way to look at it is, what would you serve at a wedding? So at a wedding, they probably don't serve sardines. I mean, sardines aren't necessarily cooked; they're steamed in the can, so that could be another issue. But those type of things, while a nice piece of fish, let's say a tuna steak or something like that, could be served at a wedding, right? So now there has to be something of significance. So the two criteria we've learned so far has to be something that cannot be eaten raw, something that can be eaten raw this rule does not apply to, and has to be something that has a certain significance, that you would serve it at a wedding or something like that, an important meal. Yeah. Okay. Even if you'd only serve it as a side dish or a dessert, it doesn't have to be the main course. So then, if it's something that you can't eat raw and it's significant enough to serve at a wedding, if it's boiled or roasted by a non-Jew, a filo b'chli Yisrael, even if it was cooked in a Jew's utensil, of Beis Yisrael, and in the Jew's house, right? The non-Jew came to cook in the non-Jewish Jew's house. Also, it's forbidden to eat this food, mishum b'shli nochri, because it was cooked by a non-Jew, and it leads to over socializing and intermarriage, unless the Jew participated somehow in the cooking. Avol, however, something that could be eaten raw. Or something that's not so significant, it's not so important. It wouldn't be served at a king's table, right? You wouldn't serve it at a wedding. There's no concern of bishul akum, of non-Jewish cooking. And you don't have to worry about it making the vessels not kosher if you cooked it. The stone came Einim ben Yomim. We're not worried about the utensils so much, because the utensils generally haven't been used in the last 24 hours. And we'll discuss that in a moment. But just the first part. So again, the fundamental rules has to be something that can't be eaten raw, even if it is cooked. So, again, apples can be eaten raw, but sometimes people have baked apples. They have like a compote, they stew the apple. So we're not concerned about, now, a stewed apple might be a dessert even at a wedding, at a king's table. But since the apple can be eaten raw, there's not a concern, right? Well, then you can have other things that aren't significant. So it only applies to these things. Okay. The last law that we mentioned, or the last point that I mentioned, it's not as relevant today as it was in the past. But I'll just explain the principle. So let's use a totally different case. We know that utensils that are used for cooking, they absorb the flavor that goes into that's from the food that's cooking. So let's say, for example, let's say you had a pot and you cook chicken soup in it. So what happens is, into the pores of this metal utensil, you have flavor of chicken. So even if you happen to scrub that pot spotlessly clean, and there's not one trace of chicken, because obviously if there is a piece of chicken left in it, then we're not talking about absorbed flavors here. We're talking about, if you would cook milk in a pot, we have an issue of cooking milk with an actual piece of chicken, which would have its own set of rules of, can it become nullified, can it not become nullified, and various things. But that's an actual piece of chicken that we're talking about. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about a person, they cook chicken in the pot, and now they've scrubbed it perfectly clean. There is no trace of chicken. All we have is the absorbed flavor in the chicken. Now, if you cook something else, so let's say they cooked No, pasta and cheese in that same pot. So what's going to happen is the flavor absorbed into the pot is going to come out in the cooking process and go into the pasta and cheese. And that creates problems. So you would have to have 60 times the pasta and cheese than anything can be absorbed in the pot. And, let's leave those details to when we get to that chapter in Shulchan Aruch, exactly what we need to do.
Rabbi,
Yes.
even if the pot was cleaned 3-4 times before it was used for something else?
Yeah, it's irrelevant how many times it was cleaned. What we are going to say, though, that if it was cleaned spotlessly and it wasn't used for 24 hours, okay? So in the first instance, you're still not allowed to use it. You're still not allowed to use it. But let's say a person by mistake, they used it. Let's just use a simple example. A person was cooking the chicken soup and they took a mixing spoon and they stirred their chicken soup, and then they realized afterwards it was one of their dairy
Spoons.
spoon. Now, if the spoon was spotlessly clean and had not been used for 24 hours, it did not affect the soup, because even though the flavor may have come out, but the flavor spoiled. Once it's 24 hours old, it spoils a little bit. So it didn't affect the soup. The spoon is a problem because the spoon now has absorbed in it both meat flavor and dairy flavor. So if it's a type of substance, let's say it's a stainless steel spoon, so we can kosher it. If it's a plastic or something, then you have to throw it away. There's nothing you can do with it. You can't kosher it. But after the fact, now you're not allowed to use it, even though it wasn't used 24 hours. But after the fact, it didn't it didn't ruin the soup. Now, I'm not trying to give everyone, a full definitive guideline of how to decide this kosher status of any mistakes in the kitchen. This is when you need to ask the rabbi, but just to put the ideas out there, at least you know what type of questions you need to ask. So what we just mentioned at the end of number 6 was that presuming something was totally kosher. So if it was cooked in this non-Jew's utensil that had not been used for 24 hours and was spotlessly clean, which, all this you have to rely on, even the commercial things, it's not always so spotlessly clean, right? It's one of the things I tell my kids, if you ever go inside an ice cream factory and you walk around the back, you would never eat ice cream again. If you actually saw how it, the conditions and how things are made. The truth is that's not true, because I saw it and I still eat ice cream. But it put you off. It'd make things aren't as pristinely clean as you imagine.
How much more? How much more so hamburgers?
That's right. Not this is really for a Torah class, but Mad Magazine of blessed memory, right? So a relative of mine once had a poster from a Mad Magazine. It had a whole factory floor, and on the whole factory floor was chimpanzees working. And they were doing disgusting things. One was picking snow, doing all kinds of things, but it says, our products are untouched by human hands. Right?
Yeah, well, the old saying was, if you see how sausages and laws are made, you would never do it again.
Probably. A lot of things. It's again, I don't want to gross anyone out, but we once went to a certain restaurant which shall remain nameless when one of my kids was very young, and he had to go to the bathroom. So he went there and it was clogged. So he told the manager, my kid really had to go. So they called out one of the workers from the kitchen. He put a rubber glove on. He stuck his hand right up and he cleaned it all out. Okay. Then he just rinsed his hands under cold water and went back into the kitchen. Needless to say, we didn't go there again. Now, any other places different? Maybe not, but we didn't see it. That's how it is. But all right. Number 7. Shecha Nachris B'Beis Yisrael. So you have non-Jewish domestic help, right? Non-Jewish maid who's working in a Jewish house. And she's cooking for the Jews. So Nahagim Lahakel, we have a custom to be lenient. What do we do? Because it's impossible that someone in the household didn't adjust the fire, right? So in other words, as long as someone adjusted the fire, then that's enough. Here, in little means to stoke the fire, because in those days, the same fire that you cooked on was same one that heated your house, and was the same one that heated any hot water you had. So it's constantly being stoked. So for sure, one of the Jews did it. It's not going to be an issue. Today, where our heating is separate and our cooking is separate and the hot water is separate, we have to make sure that someone actually did adjust the flame or something like that. And just by the way, although this law is speaking about if they're cooking for a Jew, we have to be careful. Even if they're cooking for themselves, let's say they eat lunch while they're there. So even if they're just cooking for themselves and they're using the food from your house, which is all kosher, but if it's something that would fall into the category of bishul nochri, so it's something you can't be eaten raw, and it's something that's significant enough you would serve it at a wedding or something like that, then the food they're cooking comes to the category of bishul nochri, which is no problem for them to eat, but bishul nochri is absorbed into your pot, and that can affect the kashrus of future food that's cooked there. So you have to be careful. And that's what we're talking about in the next one, number 8. But if she's cooking food for herself, and therefore it's less likely that a Jew stoked the fire, right? When he's cooking for you, you're going to make sure to turn on the oven. She's cooking for herself, you're not so worried about it, maybe. And therefore, it's possible that no one adjusts the oven. This becomes even worse than if she cooked for the Jew. Why? Sorry, if she or he cooks something that falls into the category that needs to be bishul yisrael, that a Jew cooked it, it's not only that this food that they cooked is forbidden for a Jew to eat, which may not be a problem because they're eating it themselves, but the pot, the cooking utensil, you're not allowed to cook in it in the first instance. But if he did cook in it, you have to ask a rabbi, right? Because again, this is the abridged code of Jewish laws, it doesn't go through all the details. So it just tells you need to ask a rabbi because there's a lot of possibilities. When was it used last? How clean was it? A lot of different issues. Okay, so number 9. Now we're going to get to a slight different case. So we have a different situation here. We have a sick person. Now, the chayla we're speaking about here, the sick person, we're not talking about a life-threatening situation. A life-threatening situation, we've learned many times, has its own set of rules. What we are talking about by chayla here, we mean someone who's like bedridden. So then life isn't necessarily at stake, but they're bedridden. It's not like just someone has a runny nose. It's someone who's quite ill. And therefore, you're allowed to have a non-Jew cook food for them on Shabbos. A regular person, we can have non-Jew cook for us on Shabbos. because we can't ask non-Jews to do things for us that we can't do ourselves. The example that I gave about the event on Sukkot was on Yom Tov. You're allowed to cook on Yom Tov. Okay, they turned on the oven. We couldn't necessarily ask them to do that, but they realize it needs to be. They turn on themselves because they want they're hired to cook. But anyway, a person who's bedridden and they need hot food, we can have a non-Jew cook for them on Shabbos. So the Jew, the sick person, is allowed to eat it on Shabbos, even though it's cooked by a non-Jew, and a Jew did not participate in the cooking because Jews aren't allowed to cook on Shabbos. So they didn't put on the fire, they didn't stir it, they didn't put it in the oven, they didn't do any of these things. On that Shabbos is permissible. However, hatav shel asa b'motzei Shabbos. As soon as Shabbos ends, the food becomes forbidden to eat. Afilu l'chayla, even for the sick person. Im efshet hashel acha, if it's possible to get him other food, right? Because as we explained, that the reason that we can't eat the food cooked by the non-Jew is because of it's a rabbinic decree from the times of Hanukkah, essentially that sort of period pre-Hanukkah, to avoid intermarriage, avoid familiarity of us eating together, various things. So before a sick person, they never made the decree. But and the utensils can be used after 24 hours, even without kashering, because in this case it was used in a permissible fashion. Okay. Yud, number 10. So we mentioned one of the things that's an exception to this rule is things can be eaten raw. So we give an example, an apple. You can eat an apple raw, no problems. So if you make compote, a stewed apple or something like that, it doesn't fall into this category. Now, what about beitza? What about an egg? Even though you could swallow raw eggs, right? There's people who have raw eggs. They want their protein shakes, or the chazonim. They think it's good for their voice. I don't know if it is or isn't, but people do sometimes swallow raw eggs. Nevertheless, this is not considered eating. This is like an unusual thing that people do in unusual circumstances. So even though technically you could eat a raw egg, we don't consider an egg something that can be eaten raw. We consider an egg as something that is pretty much only eaten cooked, and it's only in times of unusual circumstances we eat it. Therefore, in Bashla Nochri, if a non-Jew cooked the egg, asura, it's forbidden, unless the Jew turned on the oven or stirred it while it was on the fire, did some participation. And same with anything similar to that, anything that is generally eaten cooked, but could with difficulty be eaten raw. If for that matter, you could say meat. People could technically eat raw meat. That's not the norm. So therefore, this concept applies.
Or even just vegetables.
Well, I think it depends which vegetable. No, it's
Right. I'm saying there are some that are harder to eat raw. You can if you want to, but they're normally cooked.
Yeah, right, good. Yeah. So there's some
I
vegetables
don't
that
know,
are borderline.
cauliflower. People eat cauliflower raw.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's definitely certain vegetables that are eaten raw, no problems. There's some that have to be cooked, and there's some that's it's a borderline. Generally, 90% of the time, people eat it cooked, but could, if there wasn't anything else, or extenuating circumstance, they might eat it raw. So
You
it'll be the
could
same
use
idea.
you can use broccoli, onion, green
Yeah, so
beans.
onion would probably be an example, because onion is something that generally people eat cooked. You could, in need, there are people who eat raw onions, It's unusual, but yeah.
You got
Okay.
broccoli. You got
Yeah.
string
Broccoli
beans,
is not generally eaten raw. Yeah. Yeah. So be example. Yeah.
celery.
Celery, a lot of people do eat raw. I think celery sticks is pretty common.
Radishes.
Yeah. Radishes are probably you're generally eaten raw. So all these things wouldn't apply. So Yud Aleph, number 11. Peiros. So now we're talking about tree fruit. Shalom Spashal be ilan called sarkum. If they didn't ripen on the tree properly, and therefore they're not eaten raw. Ela alidaid chak, unless it's extenuating circumstances. So then chamim metagnim oisem besukkah, when they're sugar coated by chefs, right? So they bake them and sugar coat them, different things. Then asurim mishum bishul nochri. So I guess it's about like a toffee apple, candy apples. But if they took the apple that was not ripe enough to eat as is, and only through the cooking process became sweet enough to eat, otherwise it's too sour. That's what we're talking about. Okay. Number 12, sheikha, beer, shel tavua, made of grain, shel davash, or dates, right? So the beer we have today is generally made of grains, made of barley and hops and oats and different things. But you can also make date beer. Generally speaking, we are allowed to be drunk even when sold in the house of a non-Jew. And we are concerned about this concept of bishul nokri, of non-Jewish cooked food. Why? Because what happens is the grain becomes nullified, becomes neutralized in the water. Right? It's not like a porridge where you have chunks of grain in the water, right? I don't think anyone would enjoy that beer if it was like that. The grain essentially is totally dissolved and then filtered, and it doesn't exist anymore. So essentially what you have is you have a water which is the grain flavored. You don't really have a grain per se. But you do have to be careful that there's no wine sediment in this alcohol. It's one of the things that they have. Some of the wines, some of the whiskeys, for example, are fermented in casks that were used for wine and different things. So it's so the side issues we have to be careful about. We have to make sure they have the flavored beers. We have to make sure they didn't put any non-kosher ingredients into the flavors. If you just had a plain beer, we're not concerned about the non-Jew cooking it, because the solid matter is not what you have. You're having the liquid. Now, if you live in a place where some Jews are careless and they're lax and they drink non-Jewish wine, which is very problematic, then people who want to go beyond the letter of the law, the conscientious, they shouldn't even have non-Jewish beer, because we want to totally separate. We want to go to the other extreme. It's when you're driving properly, then you only have to turn the steering wheel a little bit to adjust as the road adjusts. But if a person is all the way on the wrong side of the road, they have to turn the wheel quite a bit to get back to the middle of the road, to get back to where they're meant to be. So sometimes in circumstances where we see that there's laxity in certain areas in the Jewish community, sometimes we have to go stricter to ride it. Now, be'inyan shtiyas kafen. Now, drinking coffee. This is talking about without milk, because with milk, it's another problem. Change chocolate or hot chocolate, vete or tea, ate nochri by non-Jew. So a person should separate themselves. Now, there are those who say casually, occasionally, it's permitted, and I'll explain this in a moment. Is awesome, but on a regular basis, it's forbidden. So what we're saying here is, is that in concept, coffee made in a non-Jewish place is just coffee. Now, in practice, it doesn't always work that way because you don't know what else was used in the utensils, even the utensils to make it, and it could have been washed in the same sink with hot water with other things which could absorb the flavors from it. And a lot of the cafes sell, like bacon and eggs and all kinds of things. It's the in a non-Jewish place, there are probably very serious kashrus issues, at least potential kashrus issues. So we've got basic kashrus issues before we even start. But now what we're talking about is, let's say you have a place, let's say all they had was coffee, nothing else except coffee. Okay, and there's not flavored coffees, which also make problems. The syrups and the flavors are also problematic. And they're not selling cupcakes with who knows what's in it and different things, which are also problematic. This is pure only coffee. So, and it just becomes a Bishul Yisrael issue. In other words, the non-Jew cooking it. So what we're saying is that it's a borderline. And so on a regular basis, you shouldn't have it. By the way, occasional. So I'll give you an example. Let's say there was a person and they're driving interstate and they're falling asleep. And at a gas station, they have a machine that only makes coffee. So not on a regular basis, but as a one-off, maybe they get some coffee, black coffee, just to keep them awake for the drive. That's what we mean by occasionally. We're not talking about on a regular basis, people going to places. And it is something, by the way, that's an issue. There's a lot of places, let's say like a lot of the Starbucks coffees, their flavors are kosher, but I don't want to speak negatively of people that go there, but if you see the way that restaurants run and cafes run, it's highly unlikely that the coffee is not contaminated by the other non-kosher products that are made there. So there's serious so it's one thing, if you bought the coffee in your house, like so you can buy, like, for example, the Dunkin' Donuts hazelnut coffee that's got a hechsher, but I'm not talking about in the coffee cup. I'm talking about you buy the actual coffee beans from in a supermarket or something. It's made in a coffee bean factory, and it has. But in the Dunkin' Donuts itself, it's highly unlikely that if someone buys a coffee, that the utensils haven't been cross-contaminated with the other products that are made there. So there's the serious kashrus issues, and I don't think you could say 100% that any particular cup of coffee is not kosher or not, but it's also would be just as difficult to say that a particular cup of coffee was kosher and not cross-contaminated. So those who live in places where there's shops that are kosher and you can buy your coffee there and different things, definitely should. And those who live in places where there's nowhere to get coffee, I mean, here there's not really any. I mean, there is one place that sells coffee, but it's or a poor excuse for coffee anyway. That's kosher, but there's not really any nice place you can go get a nice cup of coffee. So it's just have coffee from the home, not to rely on the non-Jewish coffee places. Okay. Are there any questions on the Bishul Yisrael on the Jew needing to participate in the cooking? Okay. As I said, I always get worried when there's no questions. All right. But now we go on to the next topic, and we probably won't have the time to cover it properly today. We'll continue it next week. But is non-Jewish milk. So we'll discuss modern day milk next week. Modern day milk, meaning we have a new thing today, that there's such a thing as, commercial milk and different things. We'll start off by talking about how it was in the old days, right? So people had people had farms. It was run by families, and it was the norm for every farm to have pigs. Even if you primarily had sold cow's milk, the main thing of the farm was to sell cow's milk. But people had pigs because that was your garbage disposal unit. People didn't have garbage collection. You didn't have sewage. You didn't have different things. So how did you dispose of things? You had pigs. And the pigs also gave milk. And pre-refrigeration, this created serious kashrus issues. Why? Because one of the ways to preserve the cow's milk was by putting in the pig's milk. Because pig's milk does not curdle. You can only make cheese out of the milk from a kosher animal. A non-kosher animal, I don't know the science behind it, but it's the reality, is you can't make, it doesn't curdle, it doesn't make cheese. So to get another day or so out of the cow's milk, stop it curdling, because you didn't have refrigeration, people would put in a small amount of pig's milk. So that was the norm. It's not just we're worried about happening. That is what did happen. That was totally the normal thing to happen. So a decree was made again pre-Hanukkah times, because that was the first time that people really lived in harmony with non-Jewish neighbors, that we can't consume dairy products. Well, let's talk about milk for now. We'll get into cheese and that afterwards, and butter afterwards. But milk that a Jewish person did not watch the milking. We need a Jew to supervise the milking, because that's the only way that we can be assured that it's only milk from a kosher animal and not other milk mixed in. Okay, so let's start 13. And again, like I said, we're not going to be able to finish the topic today, but we'll get into it. Halo shechal b'nochri, a milk that a non-Jew milked, ve'ein yisora eyu, and a Jew did not supervise. A Jew didn't see it getting milked. So if a Jew milked it, it's even better. But it could be a non-Jew milked it, but a Jew had to watch. But if no Jew watched, also it's forbidden. Phil last men of Gavina, even to make cheese from it. You're not allowed to. Now, in the first instance, a Jew had to be there from the first moment that they started milking. And now it's even before they started milking. Why? But I need to check that the vessel that they're milking into is clean. And there's not other things in there. Now, not only that, but the Hagul Hachmir, we have a custom. So it's not a strict halachic requirement, but it's become the norm. We don't even milk the kosher animal into a utensil that the non-Jew normally milked into, because again, we're worried what else did he have in that vessel? And what else is mixed into it? So that's the concern. And I guess, well, like I said, it's actually quite a large topic, because today with the commercial setup is a little bit different. So I guess we'll continue next week. We'll probably start this point again next week, and we'll discuss the idea of Chol Yisrael, of a Jewish produced milk, and we'll go into in depth. Any questions before we finish up? No? Well, it's good to see everyone back, and I hope everyone had a wonderful Yom Tov. And God willing, we'll see everyone back next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you
Take care.
so much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.